Okay, so I didn't necessarily intend to do a Space Jam episode, but I also didn't necessarily intend to spend a month on the Eternals and want to run literally anything else before hitting upload on the compilation piece for all of that. Also didn't expect it to be late, but there's the breaks. Plus, there is the new sequel out, and having an episode plus the review works for synergy, and look, it's a business, and the pandemic did in fact take a lot out of this operation, even if we choose not to broadcast every facet of it. In any case, the fact that Space Jam: A New Legacy is a thing that merits discourse at all is another one of those indicators that the pop nostalgia game is actually beginning to move into a space where people of my age bracket aren't the primary vector of it, which has been overdue to hit for a while now, but then again, we said the same thing about wresting control of popular music away from the boomers, and they were like, we'll burn the entire record industry to the ground before we let that happen, and then we were all like, we'd like to see you try, and then one of them did. Either way, the original Space Jam from 1996 was one of those pop culture moments where I felt a little out of step with even my own generation. Being 16 at the time of its release, I was just outside the age range to be considered its target audience, but old enough to be within its crossover appeal demographic and a bullseye for the wider ancillary marketing tying it to the world of sneakers, fast food, ironic but not really Warner Brothers merchandise, the ubiquitous soundtrack album, and of course Michael Jordan and the NBA, both of which were at the height of their cultural power, even for those of us in Boston where, hey, at least he didn't play for the Lakers, and those of us under 30 were, at the time, mostly making a serious, if semi-conscious effort to, unlearn, or at least not repeat, literally anything we'd grown up hearing our fathers, uncles, grandfathers, pretty much all adult white men say at any point ever about Magic Johnson. That's another video. Of course, you'll be unsurprised to learn that even at that age, I was already an insufferable walking encyclopedia film history snob and thus had strong opinions when it came to classic media like Looney Tunes, specifically the way they'd been recontextualized and revamped for the then modern era's marketing purposes. I could, and believe me would, talk an unlucky person's ear off about how the characters had lost their edge over the years, been stripped of their original meaning, sanitized to appease ideas about anti-violence, had the jokes about smoking removed, that kind of thing. So I was exactly the sort of person primed to be mostly indifferent to Space Jam, a movie literally adapted from a sneaker commercial in which the Looney Tunes characters were used more or less interchangeably, and the storyline's now retroactively endearing slapdash affect was at the time more noticeably a product of the era's bog-standard nothing matters end-of-history laziness, where the character's hyper-awareness that the plot is a storm of inspirational sports cliches is meant to excuse and validate the serious parts where it chooses to indulge in them, and the absurdity of actually featuring Jordan as himself, along with a fictionalized framing device built around his ill-fated turn as a minor league baseball player, is somehow matched only by his decision to underplay the role, such as it is. That's not to say I hated the original Space Jam. It's a perfectly adequate, inoffensive, utter slight distraction that it is. I just never saw it as much more than that. So for a long time, the fact of it being easily the biggest and certainly the last big theatrical mega success and pop cultural event moment for the Looney Tunes brand, rather than the superior, though by no means flawless by any stretch in its own right, Back in Action from Joe Dante a few years later, and so fondly remembered by younger fans who'd grown up with it, was an increasingly confounding fact of movie culture for me, even by the standards of someone from a generation that practically invented being very generous in appraisals of the literal definition of commercial cinema, and with reviews from professional critics at the time being overwhelmingly mixed to negative, there wasn't much reason to interrogate my opinion of it any further. It wasn't until years later that I'd ever heard anyone mount anything resembling a real defense of Space Jam, and by that point it would take the form you might expect. No, it's not exactly fair to call this a good movie, as is the case with a lot of dubious nostalgia classics, but like a lot of other quickly dismissed pop media of the 90s, it was too often overlooked in the cultural context tied to the shifting market forces of the era and the way we choose to conceptualize them. It's hard to tell the story of almost any 90s media without brushing up against not only the mainstreaming of hip-hop culture, but the marketing, fashion, and entertainment industry's full-on adoption of its signifiers as the era's go-to coding for mainstream trendiness by mid-decade, and while Space Jam fits very comfortably into a display commemorating the utter loss of edge and capitulation to corporate inoffensiveness that mainstream arrival entailed,
bling bling, bling bling, bling bling, bling bling, bling bling,
bling bling,
Bling bling.
bling bling.
Bling bling.
Yeah, it's also true that the idea of a big-budget mainstream family film built around generationally popular characters like the Looney Tunes paired with Jordan, the NBA, the aforementioned ultimately more enduring than the film itself soundtrack featuring the work of Coolio, Quad City DJs, Biz Markie, Chris Rock and Barry White, Seal, Salt and Pepper, Method Man, Busta Rhymes, Be Real, LL Cool J, and even a young Jay-Z was very much sitting at the complicated and decidedly cheesy but also watershed center of that moment. And yeah, when you look back on cultural critique from supposedly more substantive forces of supposedly more substantive media at the time, it's not hard to see how often the derision, criticism toward this or that piece of culture being overly commercial felt more like criticism of it having been commercial in that specific direction. All the more ironic considering the layers of corporate rehabilitation that may have been at play. Officially, the now infamous Hair Jordan Nike commercials that eventually launched the movie were in the in-house brainchild of the Nike advertising team, but they arrived at the tail end of an early 90s fashion fad of oversized shirts featuring the original Looney Tunes decked out in exaggerated hip-hop streetwear, which apocryphally some say had been inspired by bootleg versions of similar art having been spotted on unlicensed shirts and graffiti art in the Los Angeles and Venice Beach area. However true or not, the adaptation of the aesthetic belied an unspoken internal acknowledgement to Warner Brothers that their older classic animated IP had endured in popularity through demographic shifts to a so-called urban market, in part by being among the primary children's entertainment syndicated to standard broadcast TV. Either way, the renewed focus on the original film with the arrival of a sequel, which is inevitably a more polished and self-aware yet somehow lesser feeling work in spite of being a generally better piece of actual filmmaking in nearly every respect. Conceptually, this seems like one of the rare instances where the harder you try to be good, the more you're missing the point of the thing, can't help but force one into considering that the industry needed something like Space Jam to happen in the first place to simply set down a marker for everything else. The worlds of artistic and commercial filmmaking have never been more intertwined, but the fact that no one has since attempted anything as brazenly tied to the movement of literal product in Western movie making since this movie, literally based on a sneaker commercial starring the athlete with the endorsement deal also advertising his own comeback, feels like an acknowledgement by the industry that everyone subsequently understands where the line is, or at least where it ought to look like it is, even as more big money media based on product IP becomes the standard of the business. So the original Space Jam is fine then in that context, and in the context of its time it's interesting. As to the new one, similar energy but less there, I guess. There's sometimes only so much to say about these things. The full review will be up subsequently. Until then, I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.